Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Megzi, and today I'm going to be doing my December wrap up before the end of 2024. Hopefully, this will go up before 2025. I read a total of 6 books this month. Here are 2 of the books I own, and the other 4 I actually got from the library. This one I'm currently reading. That will be in January. So, the books I read this month, I realized in hindsight, all have a common theme of oppressed people who have suffered the ills of modern day settler colonialism and deal a lot with themes of identity, racial identity, how that is fluid, how we all mold our identities in response to various environmental factors, the time and place we're born into, and also our history, our intimate family history, and history in a broader sense, and how that all plays out. So, without further ado, let's get started. The first book I finished was There by Tommy Orange. Tommy Orange is a Native American writer, and to be honest, I have not read that many Native American authors. I read Sherman Alexie, he's probably the most well known, and I do have a collection of short stories by Native writers called Genocide of the Mind. I will put the info down below. But this book I have heard about, and I did pick it up for like $2 at my parents' local library. So this follows a group of Native Americans who are living in Oakland in the present, which is generally, I think, in people's minds, people think of Native Americans in the present all living on reservations, but there are Native people living throughout the entire US in rural areas, in cities, and it explores a bunch of different characters, their backgrounds, and all of this culminates as we go through different perspectives in different chapters following each character in the big Oakland powwow that is being held. And something happens at this Oakland powwow that is alluded to, but also is kind of spelled out at some point in the collection, in the overall narrator's voice, that I actually did not really appreciate because I felt like it was a bit of a spoiler. So, like I said, a lot of this just deals with like themes of intergenerational trauma and what does it mean in the present to be Native. Particularly, I feel like there is this idea within America that American Indians don't exist. They are a people in the past. And a lot of this book deals with what does it mean, like I said, to be Native in the present when not just your history has been erased, but even your identity as a people in the present is actively erased. I thought the book was okay. It was decent. I felt like there is an overall narrator voice that sort of comes and goes when we're going in between the characters' different stories. There's about 12 characters in this, and we follow the lives and kind of like the perspectives. Well, it's like third person, I would say omniscient or limited, omniscient more so, but limited within the chapter. Follows their different perspectives throughout each thing, again, leading up to this event. I felt like the narrator, the overall narrator voice was the strongest, and I didn't initially have difficulty keeping track of all the characters. However, towards the end of the book, like the last quarter, we start to switch with the characters more rapidly, and we go back and forth with all these different characters. It's like one character's perception, and then it's just 2 pages. And then we go to another, and I had to keep going to the like the front matter, which just has the cast of characters, because I was like, wait, I cannot keep all of them straight because, well, some of their voices sounded distinct, some of them just kind of melded together. But yeah, I do think it is definitely, I can understand why this is part of like the modern canon for Native American writers. And there is interesting history. One character well, there's two characters, her and her sister. They go to Alcatraz, which was part of the American Indian movement at the time in the 60s. And they occupied Alcatraz as a form of protest. I have actually been to Alcatraz and I've seen the graffiti that, as of a decade ago, was actually still there. And so there's like a sort of a flashback story of one of the characters and her sister going to Alcatraz and what happens there. And she meets this other native man there. But yeah, like I said, I thought it was good, but I don't know if it quite hooked me as much as like a 4-star read, if that makes sense. And again, I think the thing, just the revolving towards the end cast of characters was a little bit difficult for me to keep up with. And I didn't really like that the overall narrator in the middle of the book just kind of gives away what's going to happen at the powwow, like explicitly kind of spells it out. So yeah, that was kind of just like, I didn't care for that. But yeah, overall, I would rank it 3.5 stars. The next book I read was called The Coin by Yasmin Zaher. This is a new release. It came out this past year. And this follows a story of a young woman, a Palestinian woman, who comes and moves to the US, specifically New York City. And she slowly starts to unravel during her 8 months in the city. Initially, she has a job teaching at this all-boys school, but then she ends up finding something a little more lucrative when she meets this mysterious homeless man who gets her involved into this odd little Ponzi scheme of buying really expensive luxury bags, specifically Birkin bags, and then reselling them as a part of this whole scheme. And they end up going to Paris specifically, posing as rich people. They have this money given to them by people who are within this whole scheme. They purchase these luxury bags, then give them and resell them. And the novel is advertised as being about this, but the whole Birkin bag subplot is not really the main point of the novel. And to me, it wasn't even the most interesting. To me, I thought that what was interesting was just how the author sort of does this whole breakdown in the main character, because she's never named, I don't think. The whole breakdown of her psyche, and there's so many different themes that arise in this novel, and it was done in such a way that was so unique. I haven't really read anything like this, and I think in general, when you read it, you're like, oh, this is like the disaffected young woman raveling in the city kind of novel. Sounds so familiar. I've read this before, from Otessa Moshfegh to Mona Awad, but it's not really like any of that. The author has a very unique voice and a very interesting command of language. And I think the fact that so much of this deals with being Palestinian, the character, like I said, is actually from Palestine. She doesn't last long in the States. And what does it mean to be part of an ethnic group of people that are slowly being erased, that are being ethnically cleansed, that are being genocided? And how does that impact your psyche? How do you deal with essentially kind of like this survivor guilt? Another thing that really, I think, is really done well is how you can leave a place physically, but it never really leaves you. It never really leaves you emotionally. And towards the very end of this novel, as she is having this break with reality, she ends up recreating essentially the setting of Palestine within her apartment, complete with barbed wire fencing. And I thought that was, then she ends up throwing something at the fencing. And I think one of the lines that I really remember is, I really was a Palestinian. And I think that so much of Palestinian identity, what it means to be Palestinian, was done really well. There's also, I think, what I appreciated was there's talk of the need for control. The character definitely has a bit of OCD, and she has a bit of OCD, cleanliness OCD for sure, that is discussed in this, which is something, again, I don't really feel like I encounter too much. And this need for control that OCD is all about, because you feel like your life is out of control. There was a line that I screenshot that I thought was pretty apt and descriptive. What she says is, I came from Palestine, which was neither a country nor the third world. It was its own thing. And the women in my family placed a lot of importance on being clean, perhaps because there was little else they could control in their lives. There's also the theme of American exceptionalism and not even coming to terms with it, because the character is not American. So she's not grown up with this idea of exceptionalism except from abroad, and sort of the illusion of seeing the reality of America and, the empire in decay, so to speak. Particularly the obscene wealth gap that is especially present within cities like New York, and how that just sort of takes this illusion, this veil from her eyes. A line I also really thought was good was, America looked gloomier to me than in the pictures. There were crackheads in the streets and cokeheads in the high rises. And there was what America had done abroad, in Vietnam, in Guatemala, and especially to my people. That makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, how could the devil be the dream? So there's so much, so many heavy-handed themes going on here, but it's just explored in a bit of, I don't want to say this novel is completely abstract or avant-garde. I know some people complained on Goodreads. They said they didn't quite understand it. And there are sort of time lapses, I think, that are supposed to encounter the narrator's break with reality, where things kind of jump around a little bit. Particularly, like I said, her whole time with this mysterious homeless man and the whole Birkin bag scheme, that's sort of kind of choppy and spotty. And even her a couple random encounters, sexual encounters with men, those are even more elusive and vague. But I think what is not vague are just the themes and the need of just completely going, I think, insane a little bit in an insane world. Because if you're not really aware, I don't know how you don't go a little bit insane. Another thing that this dealt with in terms of identity, besides survivor guilt and how you never really leave a place because it never really leaves you, was also Arabs and their proximity and distance to whiteness and these sort of different racial categories, and how they shift and they are not fully stagnant, because it depends a lot on the time and the place and where you are. And she mentions there's one scene where the narrator's on a train and she realizes she's the only non-Black person on the train, and she feels in comparison that she is white, but she would not see herself as being white. There's another point where she has this idea that she is more brown skinned than she is, and her grandmother, when she was growing up, would say to her, you're getting too much sun, you're too dark, you're so brown. And then there was a moment when she had her hand next to her grandmother's, and she realized, because she always thought of her grandmother as being light, that they were the same color. And this actually touches on a little bit on another book I am going to be discussing, how race is primarily, it's not always about skin color or phenotype or features. It deals a lot with just concepts of power and privilege. But yeah, I don't know if I can really articulate so much of how much I really enjoyed this book, and I don't know, I really liked it. I would give it 4.5, 5 stars. I wasn't expecting to like this as much as I did, because I thought it would be a typical sad girl novel, and the whole scheme of the Birkin bag thing, I was just I don't know if I'm really gonna like this. But yeah, I highly would recommend it. It's definitely a different kind of voice that I haven't read, particularly from other Palestinian writers like Susan Abu Hawa or Isabella Hamad. So yeah, definitely would check it out. I would recommend it. The next book I read in December was Terra Nullius by Claire G. Coleman. This is actually it starts out and you think it is going to be a historical fiction novel about the colonization of Australia and what was done to the Australian Aborigine people. But halfway through the novel, it switches and it becomes this science fiction piece. And this was interesting because I'd never read something like this before. So, first half of the novel deals with the colonization of Australia, like I said. I didn't really know much about the colonization of Australia. I knew the Australian Aborigine people are the indigenous people. Being an American, I didn't know that Australia was, in comparison to the Americas, colonized so much later. I actually think like 1788 is when the British found Australia and they started using it as a penal colony. And so the term Terra Nullius literally means empty land. The excuse to colonize the land was this land is barren and empty and we can come in and do whatever, and the natives aren't really there, which sounds like a lot of other things that have been used to justify the colonization of a people. A land without a people for a people without a land. That's the Zionist slogan. And so the story starts, like I said, we're not really sure of the time period, roughly like 1800s. And what was done to the Aborigine people was very similar to what was done to the Native Americans. They were separated from their families. They were placed in boarding schools. They were baptized and stripped of their customs, their language, their culture. And this was done in this sort of benevolent way of civilizing the natives, but they were seen as subhuman. They were seen as lesser than. And so the story opens, we follow a couple different people. We follow an indigenous man, Jackie, and he escapes this kind of convent type of boarding school, and he's on the run. And the head mistress nun at this place, she's a terrible person. We get inside her head, and she loathes the Aborigine people, and she just wants to find this man. And she has essentially like a I forget his name, but he is essentially almost like what we had in America, slave catchers. And this trooper, he goes out and he sets out to find Jackie. And by doing so, he ends up having to rely on an Aborigine man, because the Europeans didn't really understand or know the history of the land in the way that the Aborigine people did. And so he's trying to track down Jackie. Jackie's on the run. And then we follow a settler man who he comes to this realization that he is the bad guy, he is the oppressor. And so he ends up leaving and going on the run and going with natives. But the Aborigine people always have to they're always being pushed out onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. Their land is disappearing. The settlements keep increasing. And they always have to be on their guard because they cannot stay anywhere for a substantial length of time. And there's another woman we follow. She's Aboriginal, and we follow her tale with her family as they're always moving. And then all of a sudden, suddenly we get this switch in the middle of the novel where it's no longer about Australian Aborigines versus the white European settlers. Now it is a story has progressed to the future where the settlers are an alien species and the Aborigines are just humans in general, regardless of race. And we still have the same characters. Everyone is still the same character, and they still are in these categories of like settler and indigenous, but the settlers are aliens and the indigenous are just humans of any color. And so it's an interesting turn. And, I normally am not someone that reads science fiction or fantasy too often, but this, I thought it was pretty well done. And I thought it was a really good indictment of colonialism, and also a pretty good, I guess you could say, like, educated guess, alternate history of what would happen if we were colonized by aliens, by a more advanced species. Because one of the things that is touched on in this book, which was true of the Native Americans, which was true of the Australian Aborigine people, which is, when we look in the case of Palestine, is that these settlers always had more advanced weaponry. And so when you have that, it's just like inevitable that you were going to be ethnically cleansed and genocided and pushed onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. And That is the case with in this novel. When we get into the second half, the aliens are just more technologically advanced. It was definitely an interesting book, and one I hadn't really read, but I think if you could get me to read something about aliens and science fiction, this would definitely be like a good a good example of it. I really loved, again, one of the things I liked, because each chapter begins with like a sort of quote, whether it is from some sort of historian, whether it's from like a settler slash aliens point of view. So chapter 17, Jackie, this is the native on the run, will go down in history with the other outlaws. Real or legendary, who have fought a more powerful enemy, one they cannot really defeat. All fought with whatever small resources they had. All became thorns in the sides of the administration they were fighting. All became legends in defeat. It does not matter if we capture Jackie. And allowing him to become famous and allowing him to become a role model, we have already lost. And I loved that, because I felt like sometimes people, no matter if they lose, become a symbol of resistance, and they give hope and defiance to the oppressed. I mean, we can see that even with like class struggle, right? So yeah, overall, I like this. I would rate this 4 stars. The next book I read was Quicksand by Nella Larsen. This is a really short novel. I would say it might even be classified as a novella. This was written in roughly 1928, I think, and I have read Nella Larsen before. She was a writer during the Harlem Renaissance. Her works were, at least Quicksand, was out of print for several decades, and I think people have taken an interest in her work since the film adaptation of Passing came out a couple years ago. So I read Passing, and I really liked it, and so I wanted to read her only other work. This is a little bit more autobiographical, even though it is fiction. It follows a young woman who is she's never really satisfied in her life. She is biracial, like Nella Larsen. She is half white, half black. Her white side is Danish. And she is teaching at this sort of like this HBCU down south. She just has this general sense of, why am I here? What am I doing with my life? Typical ennui. And I think that is a very common condition that is just part of being human. So on the one hand, the novel deals with, like on the surface level, you could say it deals with restrictions by racial identity, specifically being biracial, and also restrictions by gender. But on the other hand, like I said, it is really this story of this restless young woman who is just the human condition. You're just like always searching for something outside yourself, and you're just never fully satisfied in the moment. And so it starts, like I said, the main character, Helga, she is a teacher down south at this sort of like all black boarding school. I think it's like an HBCU type of situation. And then she's just like kind of just throws a bomb in the middle of her life. She just ends up quitting her job and breaking up with her fiance. And then she briefly moves back to Chicago, where she has family. And then from Chicago, she gets this temp job following this woman to New York. And then she starts a whole life in New York, living in Harlem. And she ends up initially loving Harlem, but again, she's just not really satisfied. And as a biracial woman, she becomes annoyed with certain other Black people who, as in her mind, they are just so obsessed with race. And she is tired of hearing about it. She's tired of talking about it. She's tired of politics. She almost wants this colorblindness, I think. But then she goes to Denmark because her mother's side were Danish. And I think it's not like specifically stated. She realizes she can't escape race because it is a reality. And while she's there among all these white people, she's sort of fetishized. And like one of the first scenes while she's in Denmark, her aunt and uncle take her shopping, and they just like start buying all these really lavish clothes for her. But they start exoticizing her, and she's wearing like peacock feathers and really dangly jewelry and really long earrings and all these rings and necklaces, and people are like, oh, like you're so exotic. And she meets this painter who wants to paint her, and then he ends up proposing to her, and she's just like, no. So then she goes back to the States, and yeah, again, the problem is it's something internal. But yeah, I overall really liked this. I would rate it 4 stars. I thought it was pretty solid. It definitely, for its length, it definitely packs a punch, and it's a pretty good, I think, slice of life of 1920s, what it was like for Black people, specifically living in Harlem, and also, you know, themes and questions of biracial identity and where do you fit in. And the next book I read in the month of December was The White Girl by Toni Birch. This is another Australian novel dealing with the story of the Australian Aborigine people. So it kind of was a nice like sister novel to Terra Nullius. This novel takes place in the 1960s, and it follows the story of an Aborigine woman, Odette, and her granddaughter, Sissy. And in the 1960s, now I didn't know any of this, again, historical fiction, there was this act called the Aboriginal Protection Act, where Aborigine people did not have citizenship in their own land. And so the government controlled every aspect of their lives. What town they could travel to, they needed some kind of permit, you know, limitations on where they could live, on what they were, how they could work, and also as well as like if they could keep their own children based on how much European blood the children had. And again, I had touched on this earlier about boarding schools and how children were separated, and it does touch into that, but this takes place more in the not the present, but the 1960s, where children, if they looked more white, they were just taken from the state, away from their parents. And so that is sort of like the driving anxiety of this novel. Is Sissy, the granddaughter, is definitely mixed race. She's very white looking. She's actually blonde, and she's very passing. And then Odette is nervous because there is a new sort of cop in town, and he really is, you know, rules by the books with an iron fist, and he has an interest in Sissy, and he has an interest in separating the white passing children from their parents. And we learn about like Odette's daughter and why she left Sissy in Odette's care. And Odette ends up finding out, to her horror, who her Sissy's father was. And the sort of like the culminating act of the novel is that Odette, she ends up taking Sissy to go and actually track down her daughter to see what happened to her. So this novel was pretty short. I think it was just like maybe like 230 pages, 240. It was very simplistic, I want to say. And I don't mean that in a bad way. The writing felt kind of not quite YA, but more, like I said, easier to digest and process. And honestly, I didn't really have a problem with that. Like sometimes I just want to read something that's easier to read. It's not like complex and academic and wordy. But again, it's not really like a light, cheery read, because, you know, it is about a time period in history that, I mean, it's crazy to me. This took place in the 1960s in Australia, and this was how the Aboriginal people were treated. So, like I said, it's like a good like companion piece. I almost feel to Terra Nullius, even though the authors are, you know, these two books are totally unrelated to each other. But again, it was eye opening, and there's definitely parts and scenes that are heartbreaking. But overall, it's definitely much more, I think it's a little more uplifting than Terra Nullius, I want to say. So, yeah, if you want to know anything about the Aborigine people of Australia, or you just are interested in Australia in general, because I think Toni Birch is like a pretty well-known Australian author. He's also of Aborigine partial Aborigine descent, I would recommend checking it out. But yeah, I'd rate it like 3.5 to 4 stars, I want to say. So yeah. And the sixth and final book I read in the month of December was The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I haven't read Ta-Nehisi Coates before, a full-length book of his. I had read excerpts of his when he used to be a writer for The Atlantic. And he definitely was this kind of like liberal establishment darling. He wrote a book about kind of like lauding the Obama presidency. We were 8 years in power. And I think that his politics have definitely shifted away from liberalism. I think more towards at least more of like an internationalist stance of really understanding, I think, like beyond, again, just like these false dichotomies of like Democrats and Republicans. And so this book, again, a recent release, just came out this year. There was an interview he did with CBS, I think, or I don't know, some mainstream news. And the interviewer, it blew up, essentially, the book, because the interviewer was very much mad at Ta-Nehisi Coates for the Palestine section, because Ta-Nehisi Coates went to Palestine and to Israel proper and saw what has been going on there. And so this book in particular, this has 3 essays. The first essay deals with his trip to Senegal, and the second trip deals with his trip to Charleston, South Carolina, and then the third essay, the one that is like half of the length of this book, is his trip to Palestine. And so a lot of what this, like the overarching, one of like the overarching themes of this book is about what is the message that we're getting? What are the stories that we tell ourselves, that we tell other people, that we tell generations, that we pass on? And what does it, like, how does the past shape not just like our imagination, but our future and what we can imagine for ourselves and the future? The Senegal piece, he goes to this island called Gori. I'm not sure if that's how you say it, which, according to legend, was where slave ships sailed from, heading to, during the whole route of the transatlantic slave trade. This was supposedly one of the starting points. And he goes and visits, and I think in order to like connect with this moment in history, with like the idea of, you know, his ancestors' past and identity, and, you know, having to like literally see this place physically, even though he acknowledges that it might not even actually, so a lot of this is just founded in kind of a myth. It's not really certain if this was actually a launching point for slave ships. The next piece deals with a woman in South Carolina, a white woman who is she wants to teach one of his books on the syllabus, and the school board tries to ban it. And so he actually goes down to South Carolina and he talks with her, and he touches a lot on how in recent years there's been this whole slew at the state level, at the local level, of banning books, more often than not from Republicans, anything to do with race and really examination of American history, of LGBT people, etc., etc. And of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates is, catches the ire of several school boards, and specifically one that he ends up visiting. And I love, just as someone who is a writer, or, well, I can barely call myself a writer, but as someone who has a fondness for writing and literature, I love what he mentions about as kind of that writing and reading even are inherently somewhat political acts, even if you don't think that they are. The danger, he says, we present as writers is not that we will simply convince their children of a different dogma, but that we will convince them they have the power to form their own. He touches too on sort of the protests of 2020 over George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. And I think a lot of us feel kind of disillusioned because it was like there was this moment, this kind of like racial reckoning, and then it's like, okay, where did that go? What happened? You know, we didn't even hear anything about police brutality or policing in general in the 2024 election. And you know, cop cities, they continue to be built. And I did like his message here. He wrote, some of us see the lack of policy change and wonder if the movement itself was futile, but policy change is an endpoint, not an origin. The cradle of material change is in our imagination and ideas. So that I really liked. And you know, but again, I will say that the big standout in this piece is definitely the Palestine story. Ta-Nehisi Coates, one of the reasons why this is somewhat personal for him is that when he wrote the case for reparations, and he based it off of Israel or Germany's reparations that were paid to the state of Israel. And some people called him out on it because in his mind he thought, oh, this is just like a perfect like redemption arc story. And he realizes now that the redemption arc deliberately excluded another group of people that were oppressed and continue to be oppressed as by the creation of the state of Israel. And his time there, it's really, to me, the way he just sort of analyzes and breaks down the reality of the situation. And he, of course, does a lot of research to the Israel's foundation creation myth, as well as the persecution of Jews throughout history, and the development and formation of Zionism. And he examines all of these things, but yet ultimately he also parallels Zionism to the Back to Africa movement, which happened several decades before in the 1820s. There was this idea before emancipation that African slaves should just go back. They would be better off in a nation state of their own in West Africa. And so African slaves were shipped to Liberia. And there they became, essentially, because this land was foreign to them, they didn't speak the language, they were Christian, and they became essentially, they went from being the oppressed to the colonizers. I mean, the immigration to Liberia stopped, and Liberia has a whole interesting history. But he makes these really well comparisons to Zionism and the need for like a nation state of an oppressed people that came at the expense of another group of people. He meets with two Israelis who are part of this organization called Breaking the Silence, which I actually, years ago, before I really understood the whole conflict, I can't even really call it a conflict because that makes it sound like it's an even power balance when it's not. But years ago, before I even understood really anything about the whole situation, I have a book called The Girl Who Stole My Holocaust by Noam Chayut. And he was actually, I believe, one of the founders of Breaking the Silence. And it deals a lot with like the human rights abuses within the IDF, and a lot of people who come to terms with like the reality of the occupation and like what are they doing, and that they are essentially the oppressors. And he mentions the two people, Avner and Guy's words. They were raised under the story that the Jewish people were the ultimate victims of history, but they had been confronted with an incredible truth, that there was no ultimate victim, that victims and victimizers were ever flowing. Something else I wanted to bring back to the book I read, The Coin, and how I touched on how race is ever shifting. It's not like this fully stagnant category, and it changes so much on time and place. Was he mentions the soldier who stops him and is like, what is your religion? And he's Ta-Nehisi Coates is like, Hasi Coates is like, well, I'm not religious. And the guy's like, well, what were your parents? And he's like, well, they weren't religious either. And he's like, come on, man, then what were your grandparents? And he's like, okay, well, they were Christian. And then the guy lets him go. And he says, if this had happened in America, I would have told you that the soldier who stopped me was black. And I guess he was here too, Ethiopian Israeli. In fact, there were black soldiers everywhere, lording their power over the Palestinians. many of whom would, in America, have been seen as white. Again, I felt the mental lens curving against the light and was reminded of something I have long known, something I've written and spoken about, but was still stunned to see here in such stark detail, that race is a species of power and nothing else. And I knew here in this moment how I would have fallen in the hierarchy of power if I had told that black soldier that I was a Muslim. And on that street so far from home, I suddenly felt that I had traveled through time as much as through space. But yeah, I think this was really powerful. And I can understand why the liberal media would have an issue with this. But, you know, to me, this was, I think, one of like the best in like the modern context of this, analyzing and breaking down, and particularly from like an African American perspective of Zionism and Israel and the reality of Palestinians in a way I think that I hadn't really read since really Edward Said, Zionism from the standpoint of its victims, but that was written in the 70s, and so this is just more up to date. And I think the fact that the book generated such a controversial interview will only inevitably give it more press, because I naturally picked this up because of that. And so major props to Ta-Nehisi Coates for not really caring and telling the truth. And it's not easy to be on the right side of history. I think in general that it's easy to oppose something when it's long been passed, but at the moment when something is actively happening and it's seen as controversial to speak up, it takes a certain kind of person to openly stand against it. And so, yeah, I thought this was a really good book and a really good way to close out 2024. And yeah, that's it. I read 49 books this year. And I will be doing a 2024 kind of breakdown of statistics maybe for my next video. Hopefully I'll be posting a little more in 2025. But yeah, that's it. And I hope everyone has a good new year. And I will see you in 2025. Bye-bye.